Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Zimbabwe is a failed state. To me, this is a statement of fact. Why is Zimbabwe a failed state? I think that question has got to be explored. And as a people, I don't think we've done it justice. This is the kind of question that we've got to ask ourselves again and again and explore it from every possible angle. I would like to invite the listeners out there who listen to this video clip that on Saturday, this coming Saturday, we'll be having an open discussion on the issue, on the topic, why is Zimbabwe a failed state, at this platform. 7 o'clock UK time, 8 o'clock Zimbabwean time. So to kick off, Zimbabwe is a failed state for many reasons. But the number one reason, in my view, has to be that we have had the great misfortune of having founding fathers who had no vision. When you look at Zimbabwe and you look at other countries like South Africa, Botswana, everything else is the same. Why is it that Zimbabwe failed to work as a healthy and functioning democracy, whereas Botswana has been a healthy and functioning democracy since 1966. In South Africa, when they gained their independence in 1994, they have managed to hold free, fair, and credible elections. A significant milestone which we in Zimbabwe have failed to attain. And the reason for it is that we had founding fathers, Robert Mugabe and his ZANU-PF colleagues, who only cared about power. Zimbabwe has never held free, fair, and credible elections. When we gained our independence in 1980, when we went for our first elections, we did not have free, fair, and credible elections. As much as Robert Mugabe and his ZANU-PF colleagues agreed in the Lancaster House talks that they will withdraw their freedom fighters from the field during the campaign period run up to the 1980 elections, by the time they got back to Zimbabwe, they changed their mind. They left a significant number of their operatives in the field with the instruction. Their campaign message to the people was, if ZANU-PF does not win the elections, the Bush war would continue. That is a statement of somebody who doesn't care about free, fair, and credible elections. And that is what has been the overriding political culture in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe has never held free, fair, and credible elections since independence in 1980. The people voted to end the Bush war. And when Mugabe got his feet under the table, within 3 years, he launched the Kukurawundi massacre. The primary purpose of that was to force the only other political party in the country to pose a serious challenge to ZANU-PF's hold on power, i.e. PF ZAPU, led by the late Dr. Joshua Nkomo, to force them to give up their claim as a separate political entity and join up with ZANU-PF, which they finally did in 1987 with the signing of the Unity Accord, paving the way for Mugabe to impose the de facto one-party state. And Zimbabwe has suffered under the de facto one-party state to this day. Any pretense that ZANU-PF cared about freedom, liberty, justice for the ordinary people is just nonsense. Mugabe himself was to show his true colors in the 2008 elections, when the party was forced to hold what was to become the nearest to a free, fair, and credible election. And the party lost it. They decided to launch what can only be called an electoral coup to reclaim power. And here is Mugabe speaking during that Operation Mavotera Papi campaign.
Kana ini ndakakaisa bhairo panapa ndinochikanda pasi ndoti vakomana kwatakabva.
This has been the tragedy of Zimbabwe. As much as credit must be given to SADC, because it was SADC who refused to accept ZANU-PF's claim to have won the runoff of 2008 and forced the regime to go into the GNU. What happened next was not SADC's fault. I believe that SADC gave Zimbabwe the golden opportunity to implement the reforms so that Zimbabwe could be put back on track. Unfortunately, Morgan Tsvangirai and his MDC friends sold the country. They had 5 years to implement the democratic reforms. They failed to implement even one token reform in 5 years. The constitution, the new constitution they came up with, was dictated by Mugabe. And it is no surprise that it has failed to deliver anything. The truth of the matter is the MDC leaders were bribed by Robert Mugabe with the trappings of high office, the E-Class Mercedes-Benz for all the deputy ministers, the deputy prime ministers, and the Prime Minister Tsvangirai himself. Very generous salaries all round. And for Tsvangirai, the $4 million mansion in the Highlands. And with their snouts in the feeding trough, the MDC guys forgot to implement even one token reform. So that at the end of the GNU, no meaningful reforms had been implemented. And so ZANU-PF emerged out of the GNU with all its tyrannical powers in place. This has been the tragedy of Zimbabwe. We had an opposition that should have implemented reforms, but they failed to implement even one meaningful reform. And ever since, the opposition has participated in flawed elections to give ZANU-PF legitimacy. They've pretended that they were a serious challenge to ZANU-PF when in reality they were not. Here is Chamisa insisting that he has got that he's going to form the next government after persuading people to participate in flawed elections.
Makorokoto Zimbabwe nokuti hakuna munhu anomira kana denga raronga plan. Denga raronga plan, denga harifo iri. Plan ya Mwari haifo iri. Ini ndatanga kugadzira cabinet. There is no way we are not going to form a new cabinet. There is no way we are not going to have a celebration. There is no way we are not going to have an inauguration. Let's start preparing for our inauguration. Let's start preparing for our celebration.
This brings us to the third stakeholders in this tragic tale. The ordinary people, the Zimbabwean people themselves. They were naive to have believed Mugabe that if ZANU-PF does not win the elections, the Bush War would continue. That should have set alarm bells ringing in the people's minds. If they're threatening us now before they get into power, what more when they get into power? That should have been the reasoning behind it. Because as history shows us, the people voted to end the war, and yet 3 years later, Mugabe was back. The Gukura Wundi massacre was back. And the people themselves had made that mistake. Appeasing a dictator is not the solution. When your rights, your fundamental rights, in this case here, the right to a meaningful say in the governance of the country was being threatened, the rational thing to do is to stand firm. The people themselves were to let themselves down yet again In the late 1990s, when the penny had finally dropped that ZANU-PF Mugabe and his ZANU-PF friends were thugs, dictators, and they needed to confront them to end the dictatorship, the people decided that yes, we need to have democratic reforms. We need democratic changes if we're going to end this ZANU-PF dictatorship. They risked everything, their livelihoods, the limbs, and even people died, electing the MDC CCC into power with the view that once in power, they would implement the democratic reforms the nation needed. But they were not diligent enough. As we have mentioned, the MDC failed to implement even one token reform. Worse still, 25 years since MDC CCC came on the political stage, they have nothing to show for it. And yet the people themselves seem to be unaware of that political reality. They still maintain their blind allegiance to the MDC. That is a price to be paid. There is a heavy price to be paid there. Because as it so happened, when MDC leaders failed to implement even one token reform during the GNU, they gave up on reforms. Ever since the GNU debacle, MDC leaders have participated in flawed elections to give ZANU-PF legitimacy and in return get a few gravy train seats. I have said on this platform that MDC CCC leaders are ZANU-PF Team B in all but name, playing for Team A to win and for Team A to have legitimacy. And yet the people themselves still continue to be blind to that political reality, which is why we are where we are now. Chamisa has been conning people to participate in flawed elections out of greed, only to give ZANU-PF legitimacy. And the people have continued to support the opposition, oblivious of the fact that they've sold out. So, Zimbabwe is a failed state. Why is Zimbabwe a failed state? Well, the three main players, the ruling party, the opposition, and the people themselves, have been hopelessly disappointing in the role they've played to create a democratic Zimbabwe. This is the tragedy of Zimbabwe. I'll conclude by playing a video of Dr. Nevers Mumba, talking about the 2023 elections.
Well, thank you so much. First of all, let me be clear that the changing of any dynamic or situation in any of our African countries is a preserve of the citizens of that country, in this case, the Zimbabwean people. An election observation team goes there to support the process by observing and being able to release a statement of our observations that, for instance, in Zimbabwe, we raised several issues of transparency and also the independence of the Electoral Commission and things which happen in many other countries, But at the end of the day, once we produce the report and make it available to the Zimbabwean authorities and eventually to the Zimbabwean people, it really remains the preserve of the Zimbabwean people to fight for the freedoms that they need themselves and to correct those issues that have been observed. The reason why we have multiple observation missions is to ensure that, there is a comparison, taking place between the SADC report and the European Union report, the African Union report. And then they can see that those issues that repeat themselves in all these reports, it's up to the Zimbabwean people. And this is where I appeal to all political leaders, not only in Zimbabwe, especially the elections that are coming in Mozambique, that are coming in South Africa, in DRC. We have to make up our minds that, look, at the end of the day, once the people in the country are given an opportunity to monitor the elections, because they also monitor, it starts not during the day of the elections. They must make sure that the constitutional lacunas that can affect a good election are dealt with months before the election. And they must fight to ensure that there's a level playing field. They should never wait for the time when the election is taking place. They must also insist that the electoral commissions and the governments in those countries abide by international norms in holding democratic elections. And this fight must be more vicious before the election comes.
I couldn't put it better myself. Zimbabwe is a failed state, and the number one reason for it is our failure to hold free, fair, and credible elections. If we are serious about getting out of this mess, then we must make sure that we implement the democratic reforms and ensure elections from now on are free, fair, and credible. At the present moment, we cannot get ZANU-PF to implement any meaningful reforms. ZANU-PF will never reform itself out of office. So we must create another environment in which we have got a new GNU who will be tasked to implement those reforms. And the only way to get there is to make sure we don't keep participating in flawed elections to give the process legitimacy. So our first step is to make sure 2028 elections, we do not participate to give the process legitimacy. We know ZANU-PF is going to rig those elections. Without reforms, ZANU-PF will rig 2028 elections. That is without any question. We also know that Chamisa and company would want to participate in those flawed elections for the same reason they participated in the past flawed elections, out of greed. We must be smart enough to realize that we, the people, get nothing from participating. Do not participate in flawed elections. That is a simple message. If you deny ZANU-PF political legitimacy in 2028, they will be forced to go into a new GNU. This time we can implement the reforms and get the country back on a democratic footing and get the country back to a meaningful recovery so that we do not remain a failed state. I'd like to remind those of you who are listening that we'll have an open discussion on Saturday at 7 o'clock UK time, 8 o'clock Zimbabwean time, to discuss this very same topic. Thank you very much, those who were able to join us tonight. Have a good night.